It began with a scream no one on Willowbend Court would ever forget. A quiet cul-de-sac, a place where neighbors prided themselves on manicured lawns and morning waves, suddenly echoed with chaos. The sound of boots scraping across concrete, the grunt of struggle, and a cry of an old man gasping, "You're not real cops." By the time it was over, a 74-year-old retired bus driver lay bruised and bloodied on his own front porch, while two men in fake uniforms shouted orders like they owned the street. What they didn't realize was that a single doorbell camera had captured everything, and what unfolded from that footage would expose a dark undercurrent that had been brewing behind the polished smiles of the Willowbend Homeowners Association. To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to know who Samuel Darnell was. Born in 1948 in rural Mississippi, Samuel came of age during segregation, a time when standing tall meant risking everything. By the time he retired and moved to Willowbend, a suburban neighborhood outside Savannah, Georgia, he thought he'd earned peace. Neighbors knew him as Mr. Sam, the old man who fed the stray cats, fixed kids' bikes, and tended his rose garden with the same patience he once used behind the wheel of his yellow school bus. His house, painted cream with blue shutters, was one of the oldest on the street, built long before the HOA existed. He didn't attend HOA meetings. He didn't hang their flags or obey their new visual standards about mailbox color and grass height. "Ain't nobody telling me how to live," he'd said once, chuckling to a neighbor. But behind the grin was quiet defiance, the kind that doesn't fade with age. Willowbend wasn't the kind of place you expected violence. It sat behind white fences and lined with oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. The HOA board advertised it as safe, family-friendly, community-focused living. But residents whispered about control, about the new board that had taken over the previous year. They called themselves the Willowbend Preservation Committee, a name that sounded harmless but came with rules, fines, and veiled threats. Flyers appeared on doors overnight. Letters with HOA logos warned homeowners of non-compliance. Samuel Darnell had ignored most of them. August 17th, 2022, 3:42 p.m. It was sweltering. The heat shimmered above the asphalt as Samuel watered his front row's bushes. A neighbor's security cam showed two men walking down the street. Crisp navy shirts, gold badges clipped to their belts, and tactical boots that didn't quite match the small-town vibe. They moved like cops, talked like cops, but they weren't. The taller one, later identified as Derek Cole, 37, carried a clipboard and wore mirrored sunglasses. The other, Shane Wilder, 29, had a shaved head and a patch on his arm that read, Willowbend Security Division. Samuel noticed them before they reached his driveway. "Afternoon," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Derek's tone was sharp. "Sir, we're with Willowbend Enforcement. You received multiple citations for property violations and noncompliance with HOA guidelines." Samuel frowned. "You mean the folks who keep sending me those letters about my mailbox paint? Thought that was over with." "It's not over," Derek said, stepping closer. "You've ignored summons and refused to attend mandatory meetings. We're here to issue a final warning." Samuel's lips tightened. "I don't bow to no homeowner's nonsense. You ain't police. You ain't got no right to—" The sound of boots scuffed against concrete. Shane's voice rose. "Sir, step back." Then, everything unraveled in seconds. Samuel turned toward his front door, maybe to get his phone, maybe just to walk away, and Shane grabbed his arm. The old man jerked free, stumbling. Derek lunged. The next camera frame showed Samuel on the ground, struggling as the men pinned his wrists. His hat flew off. His water hose flailed across the porch, spraying wildly. His voice cracked through the commotion. "You're not cops. Get off me. I know my rights." And then came the scream. Neighbors later said they thought it was a domestic fight until they saw the uniforms. When police arrived 15 minutes later, the two imposters were gone. Samuel sat on the porch, dazed, his left arm swollen and scraped. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. A paramedic tried to convince him to go to the hospital, but he refused. "They're fakes," he said over and over. "They came here like they own me. Said they could arrest me for my roses being too high." At first, even the responding officers thought he was confused. It wasn't until a neighbor, Melissa Hayes, handed over her doorbell footage that everything changed. The video showed it all. The men approaching, flashing fake badges, grabbing Samuel by the arm, forcing him to the ground. It wasn't just an assault. It was an impersonation of law enforcement in broad daylight. Investigators paused the footage frame by frame. The patches on their uniforms bore a custom logo, a blue W, with a phrase, "Preserving Order." Not a standard security company, and certainly not a police department. Detective Raymond Tolliver, who took the case, remembered his reaction clearly in an interview later. At first glance, it looked professional, like private security. But the deeper we looked, the more it smelled off. No records, no company license, no contracts. It was a ghost operation. The Savannah Police Department launched a full inquiry into the so-called Willowbend Security Division. The HOA board denied involvement immediately. In a written statement, board president Karen Lyle said, "The HOA does not employ or authorize any security enforcement personnel. We are cooperating fully with the investigation." But that was only half true. Within days, detectives uncovered emails between Derek Cole, one of the suspects, and several HOA members discussing new neighborhood enforcement initiatives. In one email, Derek had written, "We need to start showing these rule breakers that we mean business. People like Darnell are making us look weak." It was signed DC Willowbend Enforcement Lead. Derek Cole wasn't a cop. He'd once worked for a private security firm in Jacksonville, but had been fired for abuse of authority. His partner, Shane Wilder, was a handyman who lived 2 blocks away. Both had a history of small-time arrests, disorderly conduct, intimidation, trespassing. Together, they'd built a fake authority structure under guise of HOA compliance. They printed their own badges, ordered uniforms online, and began patrolling the streets as if deputized by the neighborhood. Residents had seen them before, knocking on doors, warning people about unauthorized lawn signs or non-standard shutters. But no one had challenged them, until Samuel Darnell did. When news broke, Willowbend split in two. Some neighbors were horrified, outraged that something so brutal could happen on their block. Others defended the men, calling them overzealous volunteers. A neighbor, Paul Whitman, told a local reporter, "Look, the HOA has been trying to keep this place nice. That man, Mr. Darnell, he didn't follow the rules. Maybe it got out of hand, but he provoked them." That comment aired on TV, sparking national outrage. Letters flooded in from across the country. Civil rights groups demanded justice. Activists compared Samuel's treatment to modern-day policing without the badge. But the truth was murkier, because buried beneath the outrage was a disturbing paper trail, one suggesting that the HOA might have known exactly what these men were doing. Investigators obtained minutes from an HOA meeting dated June 14th, 2 months before the attack. The transcript included a line that made Detective Tolliver's blood run cold. Motion passed to initiate on-site compliance, visits for chronic violators. Enforcement team to coordinate directly with Chair Lyle. Enforcement team. That phrase would become central to the case, and understanding how a homeowners association crossed a line from management to militarization. The board president, Karen Lyle, 49, had lived in Willowbend for 8 years. A real estate agent by trade, she was known for her crisp suits and manicured tone. She claimed to love order and had campaigned on restoring dignity to the neighborhood. To her, Samuel's home was an eyesore, an older structure that didn't fit the new HOA vision. Emails later revealed she called his house a visual liability. When detectives confronted her, she denied authorizing physical enforcement. But a search of her laptop turned up drafts of compliance scripts instructing volunteers on how to assert legal tone and use badge presentation for authority. She was, in effect, orchestrating a fake police culture. In the days following the attack, Samuel withdrew from public view. Reporters knocked on his door. He wouldn't answer. Neighbors said he only came out to tend his roses, his arm still in a sling. A week later, his niece, Tanya Darnell, spoke for him in an interview. He's embarrassed. Not because he did anything wrong. Because after all he's lived through, all the years of working hard and being respectful, they treated him like he was less than human. He said it reminded him of the old days when men in uniforms would do anything to a black man and walk away. Her words went viral. Within hours, the story spread nationwide. Detective Tolliver's team traced the fake badges to an online vendor, a custom engraver in Texas. The buyer's name on the invoice was WSD Operations. A further look at the payment records revealed it had been paid through a business account registered to Karen Lyle's husband, Douglas Lyle. When questioned, Douglas claimed ignorance. Karen just asked me to set up a side account for HOA business. I didn't know what it was for, but his emails told a different story. Got the uniforms ordered. The guys will handle the problem properties by end of summer. By late October, both Derek Cole and Shane Wilder were arrested and charged with impersonating officers, assault, and elder abuse. Cole, during interrogation, tried to shift blame. Karen told us to handle it. Said the HOA board was tired of people disrespecting authority. When pressed for details, he paused, then added quietly, she said some folks needed to be reminded who's in charge. The words hung heavy in the interview room, but Karen Lyle denied every allegation. Those men acted independently, she insisted. They were never authorized to touch anyone. Still, investigators had something even more damning. Body cam footage from the arrest of Cole, where he muttered under his breath, "We were just doing what she wanted." Behind the paperwork and politics lay something darker, a hunger for power. For Derek and Shane, pretending to be cops gave them status they'd never had. For Karen, controlling her neighborhood meant shaping it in her own image, clean, orderly, and compliant. And for Samuel, standing his ground wasn't just about roses or paint colors. It was about dignity, the right to exist without bowing. Each of them carried ghosts, pride, fear, resentment that collided violently that day. As prosecutors built their case, the HOA scrambled to distance itself. But one witness changed everything. Melissa Hayes, the same neighbor who turned over the video. She had attended the June HOA meeting in person and secretly recorded part of it on her phone. The audio was grainy, but one line was clear. Karen's voice unmistakable, saying, "We need people who can enforce, not just write letters." The board supports direct action. It was an explicit order, but it was enough to imply endorsement. By December, the once pristine Willowbend community had turned toxic. Lawsuits, angry letters, and protest signs appeared overnight. Some homeowners painted "Justice for Sam" across their garages. Others accused the police of overreach. Local news crews camped outside the gates. The HOA office was vandalized twice. And through it all, Samuel remained quiet. When a reporter finally caught him on camera weeks later, he said only, "They dragged me like I wasn't a man, but I'm still standing. And they still gone see me stand." But what no one knew, not the detectives, not the HOA, not even Samuel, was that this case was only the beginning. Because buried in police archives, a new complaint had just surfaced from another neighborhood, 20 miles away, describing two men in similar uniforms, flashing the same fake badges, just days before the attack on Samuel Darnell. Their names? Also Derek Cole and Shane Wilder. And the neighborhood? Owned by the same property management company that oversaw Willowbend. That company, investigators would soon learn, had contracts spanning 6 states, each with enforcement volunteers trained under the same shadowy policy. The Willowbend case wasn't isolated. It was part of something much bigger, much darker, and far from over. When detectives opened the files from the neighboring town, their stomachs dropped. The same fake badges, the same uniforms, the same names. And one haunting line written in a police report 3 weeks before Samuel Darnell was dragged across his porch. Subjects claimed to be HOA enforcement officers, stated they had permission to detain non-compliant residents. It wasn't an isolated act. It was an operation, one that had been growing quietly behind gated communities, spreading across counties under the illusion of order. The Willowbend assault, it turned out, was only a glimpse of something much larger, a shadow network built on control, money, and fear. January 2023. Detective Raymond Tolliver sat in Savannah precinct office, surrounded by a wall of maps. Each red pin marked a neighborhood under the same property management company. Brightspan Communities, LLC. Brightspan had contracts in 6 southern states, representing over 40 subdivisions, all with strict homeowner policies and private compliance teams. At first, Tolliver assumed it was coincidence, but then he found an internal memo. It was a single PDF labeled Security Implementation Rollout, Phase 2. The document outlined plans to establish community compliance officers in non-compliant districts. It described uniforms, ID badges, and even citizen engagement techniques. And on the signature line at the bottom was a name Tolliver hadn't seen before. Regional Compliance Director, Douglas Lyle. Douglas Lyle, the husband of the HOA president at Willowbend, had stayed quiet since his wife's indictment. But behind the scenes, he'd been running something much more sophisticated. Corporate records showed he registered WSD Operations, LLC, the same entity that purchased fake badges, under Brightspan Subcontractor Division. His title, Compliance Consultant. Detectives realized what this meant. The so-called fake cops weren't rogue volunteers. They were part of a sanctioned system, intentionally blurred between community safety and enforcement. When Tolliver confronted Brightspan's legal team, they distanced themselves instantly. Mr. Lyle acted independently, their lawyer said. Brightspan neither authorized nor funded any physical enforcement operations. But a subpoena told another story. Monthly invoices marked community enforcement training had been approved and paid under Brightspan's budget. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. The HOA board wasn't the origin. It was a symptom. Life on Willowbend Court hadn't returned to normal. The Darnell case fractured the community into camps. Half the residents wanted justice. The other half wanted silence. Signs reading "Protect Our HOA" faced off against banners that said, "Stop the cover-up." Police cruisers still rolled through daily. The press trucks hadn't left. Samuel Darnell rarely came outside now. The once talkative man kept his curtains drawn and his porch light off. He'd lost sleep, appetite, and peace. His niece Tanya moved in temporarily to help care for him. One afternoon, a letter appeared in their mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single line. "Drop the case or next time we won't need badges." Detectives later confirmed the fingerprint on the envelope belonged to Shane Wilder, one of the 2 attackers, who was at the time out on bond. Courtroom chaos. The trial of Derek Cole and Shane Wilder began in March 2023. Crowds packed the courtroom, activists, residents, reporters. Cole entered wearing a cheap gray suit and the same mirrored sunglasses he'd worn the day of the assault. Wilder avoided eye contact with everyone. Prosecutor Alyssa Kent painted them as wannabe vigilantes intoxicated by power. Their defense attorney countered that they were contracted security personnel acting under instruction. Then, mid-trial, something unexpected happened. Cole's lawyer produced a signed authorization form, an HOA document allegedly giving him permission to perform on-site enforcement for property violations. The courtroom went silent. The signature at the bottom? Karen Lyle. When the judge asked where it came from, Cole replied coolly, "She gave it to me the day before we handled Darnell." Karen, sitting in the back row, turned white. Within days, prosecutors reopened her case. Emails, financial transfers, and that signature all tied her back into the web. She had instructed her husband to professionalize the compliance process. He had hired Cole and Wilder. She had given them the HOA's blessing. Facing perjury and conspiracy charges, Karen turned on her husband. In a taped deposition, she said, "Doug told me Brightspan wanted to test an enforcement program. He said they were cracking down on non-compliant owners across the region. I thought it was just warning notices, not force." But when detectives reviewed her emails, they found a message sent days before the attack. Darnell is still refusing to attend meetings. If the men need to remind him who's in charge, do it. I'll take the heat. That single line destroyed her credibility. She was arrested at her home in front of television cameras, her face frozen in disbelief as officers led her to a patrol car. Detectives coordinated with the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force after realizing the network extended beyond Georgia. Across the South, they uncovered at least 9 incidents involving men posing as HOA enforcers, all linked to the same supply chain of fake badges and training materials. In every case, the targets were elderly homeowners, minorities, or residents behind on dues, people least likely to fight back. One victim in Alabama, a widow named Gloria Jennings, described how two men forced her to repaint her shutters under threat of citation. In Texas, a young couple said the HOA police confiscated their backyard flag for being non-compliant. Each report matched the same pattern, and each led back to a Brightspan subdivision. Who was behind Brightspan? The company's official address traced to a high-rise in Atlanta, but the suite number was empty. The listed CEO, Robert Kane, was a ghost. His LinkedIn profile was fake, and the phone number led to a disconnected line. Then, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a whistleblower. Her name was Mara Fulton, a former Brightspan accounting assistant. She contacted Detective Tolliver anonymously, then met him in a diner outside Savannah. She was pale, nervous, constantly glancing at the door. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said. "This isn't just about HOAs. Brightspan's a shell company, a front for a property acquisition syndicate. They use fear to push people out of their homes. The enforcers scare residents until they sell. Then the company buys cheap and flips for profit." Tolliver stared. "You're saying this was about real estate?" Mara nodded. "Always is. Control the land, control the value." She handed him a thumb drive labeled Phase 3. Inside were contracts, payments, and internal memos showing how enforcement teams were paid bonuses for every homeowner who voluntarily vacated after confrontation. Next to each name was a code: VVAC, CCOMP, and noncompliant. Samuel Darnell's name was among them. Code and noncompliant. Target date: August 2022. The discovery ignited a national investigation. News networks ran the story nightly. Fake HOA cops schemed to drive out homeowners. Politicians demanded hearings. Federal agents raided Brightspan's regional offices. Lawsuits flooded in. And while the country debated corruption and housing exploitation, Samuel Darnell remained silent, watching the chaos unfold on his television. When asked for comment, he said softly, "They wanted my home, not my compliance." Detective Tolliver's team began to notice a pattern in interviews. The men who joined these compliance programs weren't hardened criminals. They were ordinary, insecure men drawn to authority they'd never earned. Wilder's psychological evaluation described them as easily influenced, craving recognition and detached from empathy. Cole, meanwhile, showed signs of narcissism and delusional identification with police roles. The architect of the program had weaponized that psychology, giving men like them a taste of power, then pointing them at the vulnerable. It wasn't law enforcement. It was manipulation masquerading as order. In late April, federal prosecutors charged Douglas and Karen Lyle, Derek Cole, and Shane Wilder under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act RICO. The indictment described a criminal enterprise designed to intimidate, displace, and acquire private property through fraudulent enforcement mechanisms. For Detective Tolliver, it was validation, but also warning, because buried in the indictment was a mysterious name that hadn't appeared before. Subject Alpha, Regional Coordinator Unknown. Emails referred to him only as Alpha. He had authorized budget increases and field reports. Mara Fulton, the whistleblower, believed Alpha was a true mastermind. Someone above the Lyles, using Brightspan to launder funds from real estate takeovers. And then, before she could testify, she vanished. Mara was last seen leaving her apartment in Atlanta on May 3rd. Her phone was found in a parking garage stairwell. Her car was left idling near the exit ramp. No signs of struggle. No CCTV footage. Detective Tolliver drove to Atlanta himself to work with local authorities. The case had shifted from fraud to potential murder. Inside Mara's apartment, they found one clue, a crumpled envelope addressed to RT, his initials. Inside was a small note. "If anything happens to me, look at file 19B. Alpha's real name is..." The paper ended mid-sentence. Public outrage exploded. News anchors speculated on Mara's disappearance, connecting it to the Darnell case. Online forums buzzed with theories. Was Alpha a government insider? A corporate front? Meanwhile, Samuel's health deteriorated. His blood pressure spiked. Anxiety attacks grew frequent. He told his niece he felt eyes on him at night. Shadows moving outside his window. Then one morning, a package arrived on his doorstep. No name, no return address. Inside was a flash drive labeled Rosebud. Tanya plugged it into her laptop. On the screen appeared surveillance footage, blurry but unmistakable, showing a dark SUV parked across their house at 2:17 a.m. Two men stepped out wearing tactical vests. The timestamp read May 7th, 4 days after Mara vanished. Detective Tolliver cross-referenced the vehicle's license plate. It traced back to a leasing company owned by Brightspan Communities. But when agents raided the address on file, they found only an empty office, stripped bare. Everything, servers, files, paper trails, had been erased overnight. Someone was still cleaning up the operation, erasing links to Alpha. A month later, in June, a break came from an unexpected place. Prison. Derek Cole, serving time in Chatham County Jail, requested to speak with Tolliver in the dim interrogation room. He looked thinner, more hollow. His bravado was gone. "You want to know who Alpha is?" he said quietly. "You won't find him in Georgia." "Then where?" Tolliver asked. "He runs it all. The training, the payments. We met him once, up in Charleston. Called himself Mr. Arden. Never gave a full name. Just said he represented interests." Tolliver pressed further. "Why target Darnell?" Cole swallowed hard. He was a test case. They wanted to see if intimidation could push him to sell. When he fought back, Alpha got nervous, told us to make an example. We didn't mean to hurt him, but orders were orders. The confession tied everything together and opened new doors. But when agents searched for Mr. Arden, they found nothing. No license, no record, no trace. By the summer of 2023, congressional hearings were underway. Senators grilled real estate executives about Brightspan's shadow operations. Footage of Samuel Darnell played on giant monitors. The frail man standing on his porch, defying fake authority. His story became a symbol of systemic abuse, the fight of the powerless against privatized control. But for Detective Tolliver, the case wasn't over, because Alpha was still out there. And now, he was coming for the people who'd expose him. Late one night, Tolliver returned home to find his mailbox pried open. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of him sitting in his office 2 days earlier. On the back was written, "Stop digging or you'll join her." The implication was clear. Her meant Mara Fulton. Tolliver's heart pounded. He called in immediately, but whoever was watching was already gone. That same night, Tanya woke to find Samuel's front door slightly open. The porch light flickered. His roses had been slashed at the stems. On the ground lay a single badge, the same fake one from before. Only this time, the emblem had changed. Instead of the blue W, it bore a black A. Alpha had signed his warning. Federal agents now knew they weren't just chasing fraud. They were hunting a ghost who had eyes everywhere. Mara Fulton was missing. Tolliver was being followed. And in a chilling twist, Brightspan's financial statements revealed something extraordinary. Millions of dollars wired offshore to an account labeled ARDN International Holdings. The initials, YARDN. When Tolliver saw it, his blood ran cold, because hidden within those letters was the one name that had been in front of them all along. YARDN Arden, the name the enforcers had used. The name of the man no one could find. And beneath that name, on the final page of the transaction file, was a single note. Phase 4 schedule for July rollout. Priority target. Darnell residence. As Tolliver read the line, his phone buzzed. An incoming call from Tanya, Samuel's niece. Her voice was shaking. "Detective, Grandpa Sam's gone. His door's wide open. There's blood on the porch." The line went dead. And for the first time since the case began, Tolliver realized the nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun. The trial of the so-called HOA enforcers, Mark Rutherford, Clay Denton, and Captain Leroy Baines, began in early June, a full year after the assault that left 74-year-old Walter Griggs, senior bruised, broken, and forever changed. By then, Southlake Estates had become something of a national symbol, not a suburban piece, but a suburban rot. The glossy lawns and pastel mailboxes that once symbolized order now stood as eerie reminders of what order could become when it's poisoned by pride and power. Across the community, the blue HOA banners had been taken down, the neighborhood watch signs removed. Yet the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was avoidance. People whispered in driveways, spoke in half-truths in Facebook threads, and drew their curtains when reporters drove past. Everyone had an opinion, but few had courage. And in the middle of that suffocating quiet, Walter Griggs Sr. moved back into his home. The same beige house with appealing porch paint. The same front steps where it all began. He walked with a cane now. His left shoulder still clicked when he lifted his arm, and some nights the nightmares made him sit up in bed drenched in sweat. But his spirit, that old, stubborn fire that made him look those fake cops in the eye, it never died. Every morning, he'd stand on his porch and sip his coffee, staring out at the trimmed hedges and clean driveways. Sometimes he swore he could still see Clay Denton's shadow pacing by the mailbox, or hear the echo of Captain Bain's arrogant voice ordering him to kneel. But mostly, he just watched the sunrise and whispered to himself. They wanted to make me small, but I stood tall. The courthouse was packed on the first day. The prosecution called it a case about arrogance masquerading as authority. The defense called it a misunderstanding gone wrong. But when Walter took the stand, the atmosphere changed. His voice cracked at first, not from weakness, but from memory. The courtroom hung on every word. He described the knock on the door, the fake badges glinting under the porch light, the heavy boots that crushed his dignity. They told me I was trespassing in my own home, he said softly, his voice trembling. They said I needed to bow. And when I refused, they made sure I couldn't stand. Across the aisle, Clay Denton stared at the floor. His buzz-cut head twitched slightly, his jaw tightening. Rutherford kept his hands folded neatly, his expression blank, like a man trying to hide behind manners. Captain Baines, the supposed mastermind, sat stone-faced, arms crossed. He wore that same smirk he'd carried for decades, the one that said rules were for other people. When the prosecution displayed body cam footage recovered from the discarded HOA patrol vehicle, the courtroom gasped. The video was grainy, but clear enough. Walter on the floor, groaning. Baines shouting orders. Denton's hand gripping the old man's arm. Rutherford hesitating before helping drag him across the porch. And then, the chilling words everyone would remember. He should have known his place. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the judge shifted uneasily. The trial exposed something deeper than the assault itself. Investigators had dug into Southlake's HOA structure and found that Baines had rewritten bylaws, granting enforcement privileges to a private security firm, a firm owned by his brother-in-law under shell company. The HOA dues? Inflated. The patrol cars? Bought with resident funds. The badges? Custom-made online. It was corruption disguised as community order, a playground for control freaks with too much time and too little oversight. Emails introduced in court showed how Baines encourages officers to assert presence and remind non-compliant residents of their standing. One message even referenced maintaining neighborhood image, followed by a list of homeowners who don't fit the tone. Walter's name was on that list. He was targeted not because he broke any rule, but because he represented defiance. He'd refused to repaint his porch within color code and questioned why his HOA dues had doubled. He'd ask questions, and in Southlake, that made him dangerous. Halfway through the trial, something unexpected happened. Detective Lena Harper, who had quietly reopened the investigation months earlier, produced a key piece of evidence, a secret recording made by Mark Rutherford on his phone. Rutherford, the most anxious of the trio, had recorded their patrol briefings, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt. In one audio clip, Baines' voice could be heard saying, "If they don't respect the uniform, make them. That's the only way they'll learn." There was laughter in the background, Denton's unmistakable chuckle. But later in the same clip, Rutherford's trembling voice broke in. "Sir, he's just an old man. Maybe we—" I said make him. The jury listened in silence. When it ended, Walter's daughter quietly wept in the back row. From that moment, public opinion shifted. Denton's bravado cracked. Rutherford took the stand and, through tears, admitted that he'd been afraid to say no. He described how Baines controlled the HOA like a fiefdom, using threats, manipulation, and the illusion of authority to keep everyone in line. "We thought we were doing the right thing," Rutherford whispered, "until we weren't." It took the jury less than 6 hours. Clay Denton, guilty of aggravated assault and impersonating an officer. Mark Rutherford, guilty of aiding and abetting, but granted leniency for cooperation. Captain Leroy Baines, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy, fraud, assault, and abuse of authority. The sentence: Baines, 22 years in federal prison. Denton, 12 years. Rutherford, 5 years, with eligibility for parole in 2. As the verdict was read, Walter sat perfectly still. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just bowed his head, not in defeat, but in prayer. When he finally stood to leave, reporters swarmed him. One shouted, "Mr. Griggs, do you forgive them?" He paused, his cane tapping softly on the marble floor. "Forgiveness," he said, "ain't something you give quick. But hate? Hate's too heavy for an old man to carry." And with that, he walked away, slow, deliberate, free. Months passed. The media cycle moved on, but Southlake didn't forget. The HOA dissolved under public pressure. Homeowners demanded refunds. Class actions were filed, and state lawmakers introduced new regulations for private associations. But beyond the headlines, the deeper scars lingered. Some neighbors still avoided Walter, not out of malice, but guilt. They'd seen the flashing lights that night. They'd heard the yelling, and they'd done nothing. One evening, a young man named Elliot Harris, a local teacher who'd recently moved into the neighborhood, knocked on Walter's door. "Sir," he said quietly, "I never met you before all this, but I just want to say thank you for standing up." Walter smiled faintly. "Son, I didn't stand up for fame. I stood up because I had to." 6 months later, a small documentary team arrived. They wanted to tell the story from Walter's point of view, not as a victim, but as a survivor. They filmed him at his kitchen table, flipping through old photographs. One picture showed a much younger Walter in his army uniform. Another showed his late wife, Dolores, standing proudly beside their first home. The interviewer asked softly, "What do you think this whole thing was really about?" Walter looked up, eyes distant. "Power," he said. "Some men can't live without it. And when they lose it, they come after those who remind them what real strength looks like." The camera lingered on his face, lines carved deep, eyes steady. The footage went viral when the film released, sparking national debates about HOA oversight, private security, and racial bias in suburban America. Late one evening, as autumn settled over Southlake, Walter sat on his porch again, that same spot where the nightmare had begun. The street was quiet now. The new HOA was smaller, transparent, and cautious. They even offered Walter an honorary board position, which he politely declined. He'd had enough of titles. Instead, he joined a local mentorship program, helping young men from all backgrounds learn how to handle authority, confrontation, and fear without losing themselves. "I can't change what happened to me," he told them, "but I can make sure it don't happen to you." One of his men asked him, "Mr. Griggs, you ever think about moving away?" He chuckled softly. "No, son, you don't run from your house. You make your house better." But peace in Southlake was fragile. One night, as Walter closed his front gate, a black SUV slowed near the curb. He caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in a gray hoodie, eyes fixed on him. The vehicle rolled past, tires whispering against the asphalt. The next morning, Walter found an envelope tucked into his mailbox. Inside was a photo, a still frame from the old HOA footage, showing him lying on the floor, bruised and beaten. On the back, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were 3 words: "We're not done." He showed it to Detective Harper later that day. She frowned deeply, running her fingers over the edges. "Could be a prank," she said, "or a warning." He replied quietly. She promised to look into it, but Walter could tell, some ghosts don't go quietly. Months later, on the anniversary of the assault, Walter was invited to speak at town hall meeting about reforming HOA authority. He walked to the podium, cane in hand, and looked out at the crowd, a mix of neighbors, officials, and students. "I'm not here to talk about hate," he began. "I'm here to talk about what happens when people let fear run their homes. When good folks stay quiet while bad ones play police." He paused, letting the silence sink in. "I learned something that night. Evil don't always come in dark alleys. Sometimes it knocks with a clipboard and a smile. Sometimes it wears a badge it made itself." The room was still. "We talk about freedom a lot in this country," he continued. "But freedom ain't free if you can be dragged on your own porch for standing tall. Freedom is a right to look a man in the eye and say, 'I won't bow.'" He stepped back from the microphone. The crowd stood, clapping slowly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the hall. Walter bowed his head, not in submission, but in gratitude. That night, as rain began to fall, Walter sat by his window, looking out at the streetlights glistening through the drizzle. His porch light flickered, just once, before steadying again. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "You didn't break me. You just showed me how strong I was." The camera, if this were film, would slowly pan back, from Walter's quiet house to the wider neighborhood, where dozens of homes glowed faintly in the rain. Life went on, but the echo of what happened there would never truly fade. And then, just as the screen begins to darken, a final image. Detective Harper's phone vibrating on her desk. A new voicemail marked anonymous. A distorted voice. "You think it's over? You haven't seen what's buried under Southlake." Static. Silence. Fade to black. The story of Walter Griggs, Sr. isn't just about one neighborhood or one man. It's about how power, left unchecked, can twist ordinary people into monsters of authority. It's about the danger of silence, the cost of watching and doing nothing. And it's a question that still hangs in the air. When power knocks on your door, wearing a fake badge and a friendly smile, will you open it or will you stand your ground?